if you compare, most archaeology jobs with similarly skilled jobs, they are quite underpaid. It doesn't tend to be as valued as, say, going into business. So you really have to love it and want to do it, because essentially you are saying, well, I'm going to be doing a less well-paid job, but it's going to be a job that I love.
Today's guest is Chloe Duckworth, and she is an archaeologist, and she is currently a lecturer at Newcastle University, and she has published numerous research papers on archaeology. She has been involved in numerous archaeological projects in the UK, Iran, North America, and many such interesting places. She's also a very renowned TV presenter. She has presented various TV shows, and she also runs an educational YouTube channel around archaeology, which, by the way, if you want to learn anything about archaeology, you should definitely watch that channel and videos there. It's super fun. I did a lot of my research from the videos that Chloe has made. So great work out there, Chloe. Thank you so much for doing that. All right, so let's start with this. What's the strangest thing that you have found so far?
The strangest thing that I found, it's a funny question, that, because people often ask you questions about things that you found, and for some reason archaeologists find them really difficult to answer. But this one I can actually answer, because I was very lucky when, it's about 15 years ago now actually, I was able to go and work with Colin Renfrew, who's a kind of leading archaeologist, on a site in Greece called Keros, and it's an island site. It was inhabited in the Bronze Age, and we were working there, and we were working on a neighbouring island called Daskalio, and it was on Daskalio that I was asked to open a trench right at the top of the island. This thing looks like, it's almost a pyramid in shape. It's a very steep, rocky island, and it was covered in habitations, Bronze Age habitations. So we had all these walls and the bases of, where the doors would have gone. And right at the top, where I was digging, there was a wall that had obviously tilted over time. So we weren't sure how far to dig under it, because obviously, it would have been straight up originally, and it had kind of gone like that. But as we kind of just did an extra little bit of digging before we had to stop, because we didn't want to risk the integrity of the wall. And we found a hoard of metal objects, a hoard of metal tools that had been buried there at the time in the Bronze Age. And they're just really extraordinary early examples of metallurgy in this society that lived on this tiny island, with all the connections, all the social connections they would have had. They would have had to take boats to get anywhere and to trade things. And that was both the strangest and the best thing, I think, that I've ever found.
Oh, very interesting. So basically, it's like you cannot just barge into some area that you are exploring and start digging things out. You need to be very conscious about the environment as well, and keep the integrity safe and stuff. So great. All right. So archaeology as a profession, at least in India, is not very mainstream, and I'm assuming that it's not mainstream there as well. So how did you end up in this profession? It's not very usual to find people in archaeology.
Exactly. No, it's not. And I have to confess that it wasn't till I was an adult that I realized that archaeology was for me. So when I was about 17, I was choosing what I would do at university, and I wanted to go and do law, and particularly European law. And I got myself offered places at a couple of universities. And then, I don't know, I think I thought about it, and I realized that I was doing law because that was the kind of thing that, it's a good income, it's a steady job. And it didn't speak to me. It didn't spark any passion. And the thought of going to university and spending 3 or 4 years just learning by rote sort of put me off. And I started looking at the other options, and there was this one, archaeology. And I just didn't know anything about archaeology because we don't do it at school. All I knew was there was a TV show at the time called Time Team, which I didn't really watch, to be honest, because it was kind of a Sunday night TV show. It was quite slow. And But that was all I knew. So I started looking at it, and there were all these people going and traveling and doing digs in exciting places. And I just thought I'd give it a go. Went to university. And when I was there, I just realized this was just an amazing thing to study, because it was exactly the right course for me, because I've never been able to just settle on one thing. I love learning. I love all kinds of different learning, and archaeology kind of brings that. It's not a single discipline like doing maths, for example. You know, we bring in bits of everything and we use it. We're really like magpies in that sense.
Right. So that brings me to the core question of this podcast. I would really love you to talk about the bird's eye, or at least give me a bird's eye view of archaeology as a profession.
Sure. It's the first thing to say about archaeology as a profession is that it's very varied. So there are lots of niches within that. I'm going to be speaking mainly about the UK profession because that's what I know, but a lot of this applies, you know, across the world. Personally, I've managed to work my way into, you know, having a permanent job in university, which is probably the smallest part of the profession, or one of the smaller ones. Other people can work in museums, they can work with archives, and in the UK, the biggest employer of archaeology is the construction sector. So because we have quite good laws at the moment about, you know, if you're building something and there might be interesting remains there, you as a developer, whoever's funding that building, they have an obligation, a legal obligation, to get archaeologists to investigate it. So a lot of archaeologists are doing that. At the moment, our government is perhaps moving towards doing less of this, and it's a real worry for us. It's really, really important. And the big example of this at the moment is Stonehenge. So it's a world famous site, Stonehenge, and in Wiltshire, and it has this road running right next to it. So they decided a few years ago to build a tunnel that would stop the traffic from building up next to the site. But of course, the tunnel's being built through really, really historically significant ground. So that's a big example where all these professional, we call them commercial archaeologists, are going to go in and make sure that everything's recorded before the tunnel's built. So that's the biggest one. But there are so many, and again, you know, I say, you know, those are the kind of jobs that one can do. So you could work in university, you could be, you know, doing research, you could work head of development, you could do any kind of museums or curation of things, you could do conservation of things, you know, making sure that they survive for future generations. And then within that, there's a whole range of skills. So the job could focus, depending on the type of archaeology you do, it could focus on very much scientific techniques. I do a lot of scientific analysis in my work, or it could be very historically based. You know, a lot of archaeology is from historical periods, so there's a crossover there. So there's a huge range of, anyone who kind of comes into it brings their own interests and skill sets, and they can find their own niche within that.
Mm-hmm. Correct. So what I'm listening is, if you want to make money off of archaeology as a profession, then there are a couple of ways, and those would be either you work at a museum, or you work at a construction site where the legal or the government requires you to have archaeologists working on that team. Then you can work at a university, and what are there? So these are the ones, and
those are the main ones. Yeah. I mean, we have, in the UK, we have things like, we have county archaeologists. I think most countries have something similar. So there'll be the individual that, you know, if you find something, they're the first point of call. So there are other jobs within that. But I think one thing it's important to say is, if you compare, you know, most archaeology jobs with similarly skilled jobs, they are quite underpaid. It doesn't tend to be as valued as, say, going into business. So you really have to love it and want to do it, because essentially you are saying, well, I'm going to be doing a less well-paid job, but it's going to be a job that I love.
Correct. Got it. I mean, the incentive has to be like, you love traveling, you love exploring things, and those are the main incentives for which you would be going after archaeology as compared to any other profession. Cool. All right. So what usually happens is we talk a lot about, or usually what happens is a lot of the good stuff get discussed around a profession, but I think there's a lot of grunt work and things that you don't really love. So I want to know your take on what the exciting parts are and what parts are not that exciting when it comes to archaeology.
Yeah, of course. That's a great question, isn't it? Because usually people only want to know about what's really great. If you ask somebody who's going out there digging on a daily basis in the commercial sector, they would certainly say that, you know, a lot of the work can be quite tedious. Sometimes they're doing things that we call watching briefs. So say you've got a JCB digging something out, the archaeologist is there to keep an eye on that and stop the work if they hit something of archaeological significance. So it can be standing around in all weathers. I guess any time that you're digging in really extreme weathers, whether it be really hot or really cold, it's not always particularly pleasant. And, you know, so I think that the outdoors, if you go into the kind of outdoors side of it, it can be absolutely thrilling in that you can be there at the moment of discovering something that, you know, nobody's seen for maybe thousands of years. But at the same time, that's the rarity. And a lot of the time, the job's just fairly standard. A lot of recording is involved, but I think some people like recording. So, you know, we're talking about making plans and writing down what we find. But yeah, there are those intensely boring moments as well.
Great. I think such tasks are there in any profession that you choose. There'll be things that, but you do things because you love to do at least one part of that profession, and that's what excites you about that. So what I also think is, to understand a profession, you need to understand what all problems that professional who's working in that profession solves for. So what are the challenges that you face when it comes to archaeology, and how do you solve them, and what's the toughest challenge that you have faced so far?
So I think the main challenges, probably for most archaeologists, are we obviously care very much about that material culture that we're digging up, but not everybody does. So it's about, I think, a big challenge for us is just conveying to people why what we do is valuable. And I think it's valuable for so many reasons, not least because it's telling us about how ordinary people lived in the past in a way that most historical records won't do. So it's a nice mirror for all of us, unless, you know, anyone who isn't kind of a world leader or a member of some kind of royal family, we are those people who are less likely to be in the history books, but we are there in the archaeology. So a big challenge is just getting that across. I'm really keen to do that, and that's why I run a YouTube channel. And one of the reasons that I started my YouTube channel was that I teach at university, so I teach people who are often going to go into the profession of archaeology. Not all my students do, some of them take those skills elsewhere, but I teach things that don't tend to get made available to the public. And I think it's really important that if people want to engage with archaeology, and a lot of people do, they have those tools to understand it. So for example, I've tried to get across, you know, when we're digging in the ground, we have different layers, the stratigraphy of the ground, and that tells us a lot about different time periods. It tells us how things relate to each other. And so I try to get some of that across in some of my online stuff, because if you empower members of the public to understand something, then they're going to be much more likely to support it, I think.
Definitely. And when you do all these expeditions and go explore things, so I'm sure that you must be finding 10 different things, and not just one very specific. So maybe you'll find bones of humans and animals. You might also find machines those were used back then you might find some treasures, hopefully. So how do you know what that, but because usually these things are also, I'm assuming, are not found in very good shape. So how do you know what these things are, what their significance is, and then how do you sort of collect information from all the things that you have found in one particular location, and draw out conclusions of that particular time through all the things that you have found?
This is where the kind of the whole network of archaeology comes in. It's so much a group project and a teamwork.
Okay.
Because when we're digging, we're going to recognize certain things, and as you say, some things survive well and others don't. So unless you're in really particular conditions where we have extreme dryness or extreme water logging, so no air can get to stuff, we don't tend to see the remains of anything organic. So any textiles, anything like that, wood, they're all going to disappear. So we tend to find, I mean, if you kind of looked around your own environment now and thought about all of the parts of it that were made of wood or made of textile or made of any kind of organic, plant or animal material, they probably wouldn't survive. So it's interesting to then look and think, well, what would actually, last? But the thing about that is when we do find things, whatever state of preservation they're in, we might recognize broadly what they are. So digging in Britain, you have a reasonable idea of, what Roman pottery looks like compared to Neolithic pottery, which is much older. And you can tell, but beyond that, you have to send them to a specialist. So a huge part of what archaeologists do is done after a site is excavated. And that's all about having appropriate specialists who spent years studying things. When we do dating, when we use scientific dating techniques, then we can start to work out when a particular type of object was used. And if you think about the way we are today, we have fashions, right? We have fashions in the way we decorate our homes, we have fashions in the way we dress, and it was no different in the past. So things that people use like metal and pottery and glass, those things that survive well, they would have gone through fashions. So you can find the way something was decorated and compare it to similar finds that you've got a date for. And you can say, okay, it's probably from this period. So we can do a lot of that, and it's all about that deep knowledge. And it's also why there's a lot of what people might think are quite boring publications in archaeology, which are just lists of objects. But actually it's like a reference guide for us.
Correct. So when I was listening to this answer of yours, I came with a belief in this conversation that it's you who's gonna, let's say if you find something, it's gonna be you will know all about it and try to figure things out then and there itself. And a lot of this I think also comes from the movies that we watch around archaeology. So because of that, I also did this one thing. So I started talking to a bunch of my friends and I was asking them what they think about archaeology and archaeologists. So I came to hear a very different set of answers from everyone. So I thought, let's just get this over with. Let's try and ask Chloe what the myths are there in this particular profession. When people come in this profession, what myths do they come in with, and let's try and bust those.
Yeah, well, so many myths, and you're right, the movies have really had an effect on that. There's a lot of stuff in the movies that's kind of a lone person. I mean, Indiana Jones is the kind of the big one that I suppose most people have heard of. It's one individual, you show him any language under the sun and he can translate it. He goes around the world. He sort of turns up in people's countries and just sort of does stuff and then leaves again. It's very colonialist. And in reality, archaeology has been working really hard to move away from that, because obviously when you're working with people in a country that's not your own, then it's really important that you work with the local people, that they get the credit for their knowledge, because they're the ones who have the deep knowledge of what you're finding. And so I think there's this kind of myth that it is an individual, and that it's a white European or American that goes around the world and digs stuff up. And archaeologists are just all over the place. And there's that is not the case at all. And actually, I should add, because I talked about all the different types of profession in archaeology, as well as all the professional archaeologists, there are a lot of people who have done really, really important work entirely voluntarily. So people who've got their own professions and who just have an interest. And actually, I did an interview a few years ago, which I haven't published yet, I'm ashamed to say, with some people who are doing this extraordinary project in Bangalore called the Inscription Stones of Bangalore. And they completely independently crowdfunded this work. They weren't archaeologists, they were just people who lived in the city who really wanted to preserve that heritage. And they've done huge amounts to educate people about the stones, to preserve the stones, to put information boards next to the stones where they are. So I think that archaeologists are everybody, and not all of them are professional archaeologists. But yeah, they're not just one type of person. You don't need to wear a big hat and have a whip. And you know, it's for everybody. And actually, there are so many different facets to it that whatever your interests are, you can find one, I think, that meets your skills and your interests in archaeology.
Actually, I stayed in Bangalore for 2 months and I never knew about this thing. So I'll look it up after this podcast.
Yeah,
I'm like,
it's called the
I never
Inscription
knew
Stones.
that this actually happened in Bangalore. There's such things happening. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
It was, you know, it's such a fantastic project, and I'm really ashamed that I haven't published the video yet. I have it ready to be edited, but it's just an example. I mean, we've got stuff near to where I live. We've got Hadrian's Wall, which was famously built by the Emperor Hadrian, Roman Emperor Hadrian, and we have a lot of community local projects on that as well. You know, so it's really important to recognise what people do, even if they come to archaeology late and they don't want to make it their profession. They're so valuable, and definitely it's the Inscription Stones of Bangalore is the project. They've got a website.
Awesome, great. I'll look that up. So I think so. I'm assuming that archaeology has been around for a long time, and this is not a very new profession. People have been doing explorations for so many years. But I would love to also know what's the future, or what all innovations are happening in this space, and how people are using new technologies and how they are going about it.
So there are a lot of technological advances lately that allow us to do a lot of work without actually digging, which when we're doing research archaeology, when we're looking at a site that we want to dig to ask questions of it, but that doesn't have to be excavated, it's really important that we think very carefully about which bits of it, how much of it we actually expose, because once you expose it, it's more prone to destruction. So it's been sitting in a stable environment for however many years. Once you change that, then you can lose things. So we're doing a lot of stuff now with aerial techniques. We use a lot of satellite imagery actually to identify sites. And there are some really great projects around the world looking at the destruction of sites through the use of satellite imagery. And then, the local people in the area, the local archaeologists in the area, can then go in and at least record some of that. And obviously, war is a really big one that leads to a lot of destruction of archaeology. And the recent war in Syria, it made a lot of headlines for that. There were archaeologists who were killed trying to protect their heritage there. But perhaps more surprisingly, a really big danger and threat to archaeology is just farming and land development. So often, we see as the population grows around the world, we see previously untouched areas being encroached on, and it's really important that we at least are able to record as much as we can of anything that's destroyed there. So a lot of satellite imagery and a lot of imagery using planes and things, and we have techniques like radar techniques and things that you can actually use to detect what is the surface of the ground. So I should say, when I'm talking about satellite imagery, we're not just talking about perhaps standing buildings. Often when you've got archaeology under the earth, it often leaves a signature on top of the earth. So where you've got walls, you might have a bit of a mound. And if you look at that through an aerial image or a satellite image, that's really clear to see. The other ones that we have are various techniques called geophysics, which is where we can walk across an area, and they use magnets. Magnetometry uses magnetism. There's electrical resistivity, which looks at how resistant different soil is to electricity. And there's one called ground penetrating radar. And essentially what all of these techniques do is they send signals into the ground and they measure what comes back, and it allows us to see what might be buried beneath the ground. So I did a survey using one of these techniques, magnetometry, and it's a 10th century site in Spain. It was, at the time, Spain was ruled by a caliphate, and it was the capital of that caliphate. And so the palace of the site has been excavated. It's currently being restored, but there's a whole Medina, a whole town around it that's unknown. So we walked across this site, and without excavating any of it, we've been able to provide a ground plan of what that town looked like, where all the buildings were, where there were, little smaller dwelling houses, where there were kind of big buildings, where there were mosques. We've been able to map out the whole thing, actually without digging at all. So in terms of preservation and conservation, that stuff's really, really valuable.
Correct. When you were talking about a lot of these ancient artifacts getting destroyed by human intervention, probably because of wars or because of agricultural activities. So what I am seeing is, and correct me if I'm wrong. So what I'm seeing is, if there's a very economic oriented activity that's happening, or an important activity that's happening, then archaeology and archaeological artifacts and everything, they do not get priority and they get ignored. So and I think or at least I'm assuming this happens because people do not really understand the importance of archaeology and why it's so important. So if you could talk about why it's so important for us as a species to look at all these things and understand archaeology and historical events through it.
Yeah. I think what archaeology gives us is it tells us who we are, not just in terms of who we are right now, but who we have been in the past over long periods of time. And it's really, for me, it's the story of humanity, because as I said, I love history, and I did history before I did archaeology, but history tells us one particular story, whereas archaeology gives us the chance to access all the stories that maybe nobody thought it was worth writing down, or they couldn't write them down because they weren't literate. And so it gives us a sense of who all of us are. And it's what I said before about it, this myth of it being about an individual, when in fact it's about everybody and it's about teamwork. And looking at the past, it's also about everybody's past. And I think what really amazes me and what is really important to archaeology are just those kinds of projects I mentioned earlier, where local people say, actually, this is our heritage and we want to protect it. And it doesn't have to be the extremes of, giving up your life in those tragic cases in Syria. But the fact that people are willing to do that demonstrates how important that heritage can be to people. And so I think the most valuable thing that people should realize is that archaeology is beneath all of our feet. Anywhere in the world that you are, there's probably going to be some interesting archaeology not too far from you, and it belongs to you. It doesn't belong to academics or the people who are lucky enough to have jobs in archaeology. It belongs to everybody, and it's our story.
Correct. Like you were talking about archaeologists being killed in Syria. Is it because they were just there and then they got killed in the crossfire, or is it like they were protecting something and they risked their lives for that particular thing? And what's the rationale, if that is true, then what's the rationale behind putting your life at stake and protecting something that's of ancient value?
Yeah, they were. There are several incidences when, some were killed. There were quite high-profile cases, but also many people who survived, but who were risking their lives frequently during the midst of that war to protect their heritage. I think it's. There's an extent to which people's identity can be linked with archaeology, and it can be archaeology under the ground, but it can be things like standing ruins. And I think especially if you live in an area and you've grown up with that your whole life, it maybe becomes part of who you are, how you see yourself and how you're maybe different to somewhere else. And I think it's a source of great pride for a lot of people. I think there's a nastier side to that when sometimes archaeology gets used for, I mean, it was famously used by the Nazis in the 1930s and the 1940s in Germany in order to claim a sort of pure, racially pure heritage. So there are times in which that link with identity is used in a really ugly way. But there are, most of the time, it's really about people just feeling very passionately that this is something fragile, it's something beautiful, and it's something that must be protected, because if we don't protect it, you know, it's forgotten. And maybe there's an extent to which all of us would like to think that we'll be remembered in the future as well. So I think if we go and if we make sure that we protect the past, then maybe we have more confidence that people in the future will protect our, you know, the memory of us as well.
It's a lot of emotions behind what people are doing and why they are risking all their lives and everything for this one thing. I think that's huge. Let's say somebody is gets excited about this profession of archaeology, hopefully through this podcast. Then what are the next steps that they should take, and how should they go about doing their research on this profession, and if they like it, then how do they go ahead with it?
I'd say, I mean, certainly look online, because there are a growing number of resources, not just my own channel, but there are lots of things on YouTube. So you can get a lot of good background knowledge from that. But I'd also say to find out what's going on near to you. Look at the local cultural heritage, the local archaeology around you. If you can get in touch with anybody who's working on that, then, you know, if you're able to, then volunteer for it.
Okay.
Obviously, there's the kind of traditional university route, which people can take, and that will qualify you then to seek a job in archaeology. But it's not the only route by any means. And as I've said, there are lots of people who come to it later in life who've maybe done something else and then come back and think, actually, I really want to do this. So find out what's going on near to you and see if you can be involved with it. The other thing I'd say is that often, because archaeologists are, you know, you said yourself, it's a niche job, we tend to be quite a community. So if we see that someone's willing and is there, you know, ready to engage with it and ready to do the work, then when an opportunity comes up, they're going to be at the front of our minds, as it were. So I think to anybody who's interested, reach out and see what you can find locally.
Correct. I think this is very interesting that you have brought up. It's a niche job, and then it's sort of a community. It's like a, I don't know if I am correct if I say it, but it's sort of a cult that you're building, and if somebody's coming in, then a lot of support is shown and all that. So I think that's you. That's great. Now, I would like to ask the last question for the podcast. As I said earlier, that I am working in the education space and I want to revolutionize the education system. So what I have at least realized being in Indian education system is that professions like archaeology, for example, do not get as much importance as other professions. So if you were to redesign the education system so that system would be a little more sensitive or considerate of professions like archaeology, then how would you go about building that system?
I think this is a brilliant question. And I just should say as well, I think we have a similar problem in the UK at the moment, because we have a huge focus on science, technology, engineering and maths, which are of course immensely important, but we're just forgetting all the creativity. We're forgetting that knowledge can actually cross over between lots of different disciplines. And I think what the education system needs is maybe less focus on testing and more focus on building up people's skills, critical skills, sort of creative skills, you know, and history and archaeology and even things like art are going to be able to do that. And I think today we just don't value those things enough. And there's so much of what makes us human. And I just think it's a real shame that we're all treated as cogs in the wheel. You know, you must get this type of job, and this is going to make you a useful member of society, when in fact a lot of those jobs are actually, if you don't go into it because you want to do it, it's going to be soul destroying. So yeah, I think education system, I would say less testing, more diversity in what's taught, and more emphasis on critical thinking. So being able to think for yourself, and, you know, you read a newspaper article and being able to deconstruct that and ask, you know, who's written this and why, and not just take it at face value. Those skills are so important to having a kind of good democratic society, I think. So yeah, just more of that, more of that.
Correct. So basically what I'm listening is that we should have a system which imparts the fundamental skills rather than focusing on just particular professions, and also give them a lot of liberty to explore different professions and understand what's happening, and then choose for themselves what they really love doing and would love to pursue.
Yeah, I think so. I think that summarizes it well, because I think people are innately curious and we want to learn. And often, I mean, it's a bit of a joke, but often what school does is kind of bully you out of that, out of that curiosity, and it should be the opposite. So I think if you give people the space to explore their interests, that they're going to learn anyway. And I really believe that.
Correct. The system has been, I think, designed in a way which helps the one who has designed it to make their jobs easy. So it's because incorporating all those things, I also think is pretty tough, and probably they haven't been able to crack that. But just because we cannot solve for it, or we do not have immediate answers for those things, we shouldn't stop thinking about those problems, and should think about changing those. So yeah, I mean, I had a great talk with you, and learned a lot about archaeology. I think the exploration of myself is not going to end here, so I'll keep on learning about things, especially the Bangalore one which you had mentioned, and hopefully I think you have already recorded a video on that, right? So I'll be looking out for the video when it comes out. So thank you so much for doing this, and I really love talking to you. And hopefully we at least one person, if we could get into archaeology after this, after listening to this podcast, then it will be a great achievement. So yeah,
That would be
thank you so much.
wonderful. Thank you.